I'm going to share with you an exercise for my students in the Zoom class on painting trees. If you would like more information about my Zoom classes or courses, please check the description below. I'm working on non-sanded paper. It's light mid-tone. It's meant to be more like a sketch, but if you want to enjoy it better, you probably should take a background that's a little bit darker than this, so you don't spend all that time trying to make things darker in the distance. Also, maybe work on a sanded paper, toned sanded paper. It might be a little bit easier to create the texture and not to overwork the surface. So I'm starting with a sketch and I'm working with a soft vine charcoal, and it's very easy to move around, to blend into the paper. And right now I'm setting up the values in the tree trunks and also the texture. And the texture in these two tree trunks is very different. One is smoother, it's emphasized more horizontally in the aspen trunk, and the trunk on the left must be a pine tree, and that one has those textured grooves in the bark running alongside. Right from the beginning, I also want to set up a little bit of depth, so I'm giving a little bit darker background in the distance, but I ended up actually creating even darker background later in the part 2. But right now even this helps, and there are some tree trunks, smaller tree trunks in the distance that we see, and you can also suggest them just like this, just leaving some areas of paper color and painting around them with a darker color, and that just suggests something without creating too much of a detail, and later you can elaborate on that, but right now it just gives you a hint what's in there. And I keep emphasizing those longer lines running alongside the tree vertically, and these are the darkest lines in the bark. And I'm still working with a soft charcoal, but now I also added a little bit of a darker. There are different grades of charcoal, and there's a darker one, kind of more compressed, so you can add some of it or you can just switch to the softer pastels. I'm planning to add color on top of charcoal, so I'm going to add softer, richer color on top of the black and white sketch. So right now it's just planning. It's a planning stage, and it's planning my values as well. And eventually it's going to be helpful that I took some time to explore the scene and to actually see where the darkest values are, where the lighter values are, and how to suggest maybe even those trees in the background, how that is going to look. So later when I pick up the colors, I will see immediately when I place that color into the area, I will see if it matches the value or not, if it should be lighter or darker. But the soft charcoal has a little bit of a drawback when working on the non-sanded paper. It kind of tends to make the surface a little bit slicker, and then the pastel is going to have harder times holding onto the surface, the tooth of the paper. So that's something to consider. And here I also want to create some of that detail in the bark, particularly those darker areas, so that later I work with a lighter color over that and keep some of that darker color. And I am emphasizing those lines in the bark of their aspen so that they are describing that round surface, round shape of the tree. So they shouldn't be just straight, but they should be like running around that cylinder. If we look upwards on the tree, so they will be curved upwards, and at the eye level, those lines might look horizontal, but that will be changing with the angle. So this is right now almost there, and even the aspen tree trunk is also darker at the end, at the very bottom, so I will have some of that texture to add, but right now it's just a little bit darker there as well. And that's what also attracted me picking these two, the reference with these two, the difference in the texture. And also there's a flower here, but the flower, I kind of just did the flower just to see how it's going to look, but I ended up having the flower a lot larger than it should be, so you will see. And here comes the color. So I start with a background here, a little bit of green, and I'm using slightly cooler green in the distance so it doesn't jump out. So the darker green as well, particularly here on the left side, that I plan to have darker in the distance, and I shouldn't just stop that darker green on the left of one tree and then just go into totally lighter color. It should be continuing a little bit so that there is continuity in the background, and that helps to visually perceive the situation as more realistic. Well, things are just not stopped all of a sudden, and then we just have to guess what happened. So for the dark of the bark of this very textured pine tree, I'm using first my darkest colors and a little bit of this warmer color on the side of the tree that gets more light, so we get a little bit warmer color here in the foundation. Then I will bring even lighter color to that, and there's also a little bit of red, kind of not sure what it is, but there's some brighter reddish brown there, so I decided to add some of it as well. And it's pretty much green situation with some of those purples that I'm using here. So if I can warm up the area a little bit, warm up the scene, I think it's a good idea to make it more alive, bring some warmth into it. And now I was working with the softer pastels, but now I also decided to pick up some of this green color, lighter green, and just did a little bit of a cross hatching around. The key to preserving the texture or painting the texture in the tree, and even on this rather smooth non-sanded paper, is to create these kind of grooves, very dark grooves in the surface, and then adding those somewhat lighter colors and later lighter colors where needed, where the tree catches more light. And those lighter colors are going to be between those darker grooves, and also keep the direction, emphasize the direction of the bark. So gradually also changing to somewhat lighter color gradually. So right now I'm kind of neutralizing a little bit some of those darker browns with this gray purplish color. So it comes down, but I still have some of that darker brown and darker purple showing through it. And now the aspen. And the aspen has to be a little bit darker on one side. It's in the shadow there. And then I also use those kind of greenish grays. And greenish grays is a good choice because there's some of that reflected light still bouncing into the tree bark, and there's a lot of green color around, so there will be some green cast to it. And also this is a smoother bark, smoother surface, so even blending it a little bit will be resulting in a nice effect. So another point here to remember, some of those lines that I set up, of course, if I blend it, they will be gone, and I will need to bring them back. So with some darker color, I'm going to set them up and spend a little bit of time to kind of look at the direction of those lines. And then the lighter color eventually will go on top of that darker line, but to create the look of the fold, there will be a little bit of that darker color still showing under. We'll see. I added a little bit of maybe maroon and added more highlights even on that left tree trunk. So now with the lighter color, I'm adding some of those lightest values, but not the lightest highlight yet. But so far in the aspen tree, we can see the darker tone on the left of the tree trunk, that darker gray. Then we have the mid-tone, and now I'm bringing this even lighter kind of greenish gray on the right, where it gets most of the light. So the bottom of this is a little bit rougher, so I'm not going to make it smoother, I'm just suggesting some texture in it. And I decided to take care of some of this green in the background a little bit, so it's not just one monotonous kind of cool green color. I added a little bit of that warmer yellowish color as well. So darkening some of these areas, texture areas on the tree trunk, patches of those of that darker color, and emphasizing again the stripes, horizontal lines. If I lose some of those lines, whether on the left tree, the pine tree, or on the aspen, then I can just go back and reinforce it to show those more recessed lines. And can make this a little bit darker because my gradient here within the tree was pretty smooth. There wasn't a big jump from darker color to lighter, so I can adjust my darks and lights. And here's the highlights on the aspen tree, and you can see how now it really gets that three-dimensional shape. And here on the lines, if you look at the reference photo, you will see that there's a little bit of darker color showing on the downside of that fold, that horizontal line. The top catches a bit more lines, so that will make it more realistic, three-dimensional looking. And of course I can overdo that easily, but now I also just working like this, I can reinforce my straighter edge on that tree. And it's something that you should think about, whether you need really all that straight edge all the way from the bottom to the top. So you might want to interrupt it, keep it softer, or have some grasses covering it a little bit. It's something that creates a little bit easier edge if we're softening it a little. So now the grasses. Of course, I don't want to cover up all that nice work I did on the tree trunks, on creating that texture at the bottom, but at the same time having a little bit of those grasses, a little bit of the detail overlapping the tree trunks. It just grounds them better, so creates a better connection with the ground. And a little bit of that lighter tree trunk and the darker, more vertical tree trunk that we see in the distance. But I'm just suggesting them. I don't want to really create any kind of detail there. They're just suggested, and then it just will be the background. So something that I didn't really do, but probably should have done, because I still wasn't quite sure if I'm just leaving it that way. I decided to eventually blend the color here, particularly on the left top, blend the color there into the paper and create a little bit smoother, darker tone. That will be in the part 2. But you can see right now at the bottom of the tree trunk, the spine on the left of it, when I blended that darker color into the paper, it immediately was smoother and was a richer color. And that's because less of that lighter color of the paper showing through. So to create more depth, you're probably better off, before you start adding any of that lighter color in the left area, you're better off to blend that dark color in. When we work with the underpainting on neutral or white paper, that would be just handled by creating a darker wash in that area, so darker underpainting. But here, it just has to be achieved by blending. And right now I'm placing this flower, and of course it's quite a bit larger than it really should be. And even in the reference it kind of pops, so it really needs more flowers around it to balance it out. And I didn't even do the one that's behind the tree, but at this size it's really big and it kind of jumping out. If it was staying dark, like that dark purple, slightly lighter purple, that would be okay. But because this light part of it, inside part of the columbine, is really light, it just jumps out. So what we can do about it is add some lighter colors maybe around it, so it merges with a lighter shape. So I'll have to work around it in part 2. here right now I'm just adding some of those little branches. It looks like it's all dried out here, and it has some of the branches that kind of thinner, some a little bit thicker. So that's what creates the character. And I like how this pine tree trunk is actually kind of merges, blends with the background a little bit. So it's on the reference as well. And this way I don't have both trees with very sharp edges. So it kind of gives a relief to the eyes. And now also with a lighter color, and notice I'm not picking up the very light, the white color. Right now I'm just kind of working with a cool pinkish color, but it's not the lightest, and I'm just suggesting some of those thinner branches kind of radiating from that tree. A little bit more touch up here and there, but I will have to get back to this area in the part 2. So some of these greens now, rich greens, and behind the tree, so it kind of continues this illusion of somewhat darker color, maybe in the shade, and then I will add some other warmer greens as well. This started with a reference photo, but then you just jump off and build the grass around it, build the branches. So it's not really copying the photo. I decided to deepen the color behind the tree trunks so that I emphasize the depth, that there's something darker in the distance, and then my tree trunks are going to stand out against it a little bit more. So suggesting more depth with this. And that's something that you probably should have done sooner. But since I was just kind of exploring different things here, I didn't do it right away. But you can create that darker background as soon as you add the tree trunks, or even before that, and then just blend it in, and then just build your textures and everything else. So that would be easier because you would set up your darker colors first and then work with your maybe chromatic colors, maybe some lighter colors on top of it. And here I'm just trying to kind of work it backwards a little bit. So do something that I didn't do there in the first part, but it still worked. It's still kind of darker area behind. I didn't really have much that would make it chalky, so it still worked. Now I'm emphasizing some of these darker branches now that some of them got a little bit more blended maybe, and I added a little bit of that cooler color, cooler purplish or bluish purple kind of there, and also decided to add a little bit of green to the edge of the bark, so to imitate how it would be picking up a little bit of green. But this doesn't seem to be that really bright sunny day, so maybe it doesn't get as much of that green reflected light. And on the aspen tree, I also added a little bit more color here, kind of bluish gray again, to emphasize the darker side. And here, if I start losing a little bit of that tree trunk here, so might want to come back with a darker color. It's a dark green, getting that darker grass in this area. Some of them areas that are below the leaves, there's some shade there, so that darker green helps. And of course it's tempting to just go all around the bark and keep refining it. So sometimes it's a good thing, sometimes it's not. I'm trying to create a look that the light on the bark is kind of more focused along certain area, not from side to side. And now with this somewhat cooler, lighter green, again I'm adding some of those greens in the distance. And the cooler color has that ability that it makes things recede. So that's why I'm adding cooler colors here, and we'll be emphasizing more of a warmer colors that closer to us. So, and just to suggest maybe some leaves in the distance, I'm just employing different size of marks, different character of marks, so they look like a branch or some foliage. And now this warmer green here closer to us, it's definitely very different, and it does set up kind of different areas of green in the painting. And I kind of like that it goes on a diagonal here. And a little bit of that warm color, even at the top, doesn't hurt. But it's not as intense as what's closer to us, and it doesn't have that detail. Trying to get a little better shape for both of the trunks and employing different grays, getting the better edge. And you can spend a lot of time trying to do this, trying to observe all the details. And now it's time to maybe downplay the flower a little bit. It just sticks out a little too much, being so large. So first I'm trying to get white a little bit less jumping out, so it's just light shade of blue instead, maybe blending with the purple of the flower a little bit more. And then I'm bringing also some brighter greens maybe in the area next to the flower, so that visually might create that lighter shape, and it will not be that just the flower kind of stands out, but that there will be lighter shapes right next to it, and that will help to kind of distribute the viewer's attention a little bit away from the flower. So the attention is on the whole area, not just on the flower. And then maybe just overlap it with a couple of grasses or something like that, downplaying it. Basically, that's what I was trying to do. But of course, the size of it, that's the big problem here as well. But I didn't do that. I didn't try to correct that. I just decided to let it be, and you can see how important it is to scale things appropriately. And I'm adding some of the highlights now with somewhat lighter color than previously. Here it's a little lighter, so I decided to go with that. Again, just adjusting the colors in the trunk a little bit. Also here the edge, and that lighter color of the paper still showing through the darker areas, even here in this pine trunk. That's actually working okay, because that helps to create the texture, and that's what we are doing here. In other areas, for example in the distance, not so much, because we want that to be quiet, so our textured tree stands out more, and maybe some green on that darker color in the distance, but not so much just the area overall being so busy. We don't want that. So again, suggesting some of the trees, but just to suggest, really, not creating details. And that's the fun part. You can just play with different shapes, setting them up, and see what effect they produce. Sometimes just the mark can suggest something, so I definitely recommend playing with that more. So that's for that slanted tree. Maybe some green foliage, some vines overlapping it. So how many times now I already defined those lighter highlights on the branches and then went over that, and now doing it again. So here's the lesson to learn: reserve it for later. The highlights should be done later. It's okay on a study like this, but if you are trying to do something more permanent, so to speak, more finished, then you definitely don't want to be going back and forth. Those very light highlights on the branches, almost white, those definitely should be done later. Highlights on the tree obviously are not going to be as light as the highlights on the aspen tree, so it's just a different color, but we definitely need to create that illusion of light and shadow on that bark. And now very little left to do here. I want to keep it just as a sketch. I think the overall idea is accomplished. The texture, even a little bit of depth. Lots of texture on both of these, even on a smoother tree trunk. If this video was helpful to you, please give it a like. That will let YouTube know that more people should see it. I have more videos about painting trees, and if you haven't watched them yet, you can check them out next.